the great Dr. Richard Fleming. He's got so many degrees. He's a PhD in physics. He's a medical doctor. He's also an attorney. And he's a great American fighting for the truth, fighting for what's right, for medical freedom. And he's got a really, really important topic today. Are we the next endangered species? Bioweapons, eugenics, and more. Welcome, Dr. Fleming.
So give me a moment and we'll get this connected here. Can you see that? Yeah. All right. So I'm a PhD. I solve problems. I'm an MD. I treat problems. And I'm a JD. I cause problems. And I'm here in all three official capacities. And I'd like to say that I felt like I was going to be somewhat unique, but since the mainstream media is here, let me start this off by pointing out I am also a convicted felon for having treated patients with a single dose of radioactive isotope instead of double dosing them, and for using a billing code that the government believed I made $50 extra per test on, so they had 10 cases, which equals $500, which equals a felony. You can go to FlemingMethod.com if you want to read about it, and you will see how the government does hide evidence. But the problem with hiding evidence and trying to get rid of somebody like me is I'm a Viking pureblood. And you're going to see that today because today's job is to ask you a question: are we the next endangered species? Bioweapons, eugenics, and more. You're going to leave here with an action plan today, and you're going to ask, how did we get in this mess? And many of you think that this is something that was just happening recently. It has been happening for some time. We're here because of tyranny, the oppression of a people by a government or people in power. This is not a new concept. What you're looking at here is a picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware on December 24th with one of my ancestors, Captain Fleming. To do that, we had to have a declaration of war. That was the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote, and he took 2/3 of that from the Flemish 1581 Declaration of Independence in Belgium. That required a declaration of war. The crossing of the Delaware was the first offensive move made by the United States military. You do not win a war on defense. You only win it on offense. It was following that the United States Constitution was brought into being in 1789, and the United States of America lasted a grand total of 72 years. But we were here for tyranny. Now, tyranny, most people think of as the oppression of somebody else, and when you ask most people, they will say American slavery. Every winning army, every king, everybody who beat up another nation took their people as prisoners. They enslaved them. And that was also true of 5 civilized nations of the American Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw. They owned African-American slaves. Now, there's nothing good about owning slaves. My ancestors did it, Vikings, Norwegians. It's nothing to be proud of, but we were not the only ones, and the United States. This presentation is to explain facts to you so that you will have a fire lit underneath you and inside of you so that you will go take actions. A great amount of work has been put into this, and this book is coming out in June, Are We the Next Endangered Species? It was not written because I thought it was a rhetorical question. It is because you are at risk, and I'm presenting you the evidence of that. We lasted as a country for 72 years. In the 1850s, the United States of America, after the founding fathers were dead, began a new pathway on bioweapons, eugenics, and the usurpation, the taking of power from the medical system through a group of people that called themselves the American Medical Association, of which fewer than 1 in 4 of us physicians belong to. Biological warfare is dated back for thousands of years. It was brought to this continent by the British when they used smallpox. During the Civil War, or the war between the states, as my southern friends call it, because there was nothing civil about it, we used smallpox and biological weapons. 1975, we had decided as a world that we no longer wanted to use chemical or biological weapons because they were too dangerous. Eugenics was reborn in the 1850s. The Greeks practiced it and sacrificed 1 in 4 of their children because they were imperfect. We know that because we have found the bones of their dead children at the bottom of wells from where they said you're not perfect enough to be in our society. And they found the bones of dogs and wolves down there that were thrown down there to kill their children as they were being tossed in the wells. This lays out the list from Darwin to Galton, who happened to be a cousin of Darwin, and even Churchill's views on eugenics. And the 1914 Laughlin Report really took this country forward on a eugenics program. Here are some of the individuals that you get to hear the names of: Graham Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, Helen Keller, Theodore Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger were all admitted eugenicists. They believed in eliminating the people that they did not see as superior to themselves. Now, as a Norwegian, I could stand up here very proudly and promote that theory because we were the ones that Adolf Hitler eulogized. But the reality is my responsibility as a descendant of somebody who was responsible for the Declaration of Independence, of crossing the Delaware with Washington, is to fight for you. But my fighting for you does no good if you do not fight for yourselves and get the rest of the Americans to do so. The Rockefellers funded a lot of this. These are secret documents that you will see in the book. They've not been seen before. These are whistleblower documents provided to me from the Rockefeller Foundation, where they spent millions of dollars to provide eugenics programs in the United States, to work on bioweapons in the United States, and to take over control of the American Medical Association in the United States. The eugenics movement that began with Laughlin's report in 1914 resulted in a Sterilization Act in 1924 by Virginia, which eventually led to the case of Buck v. Bell, a 17-year-old girl who was forcibly sterilized. And you can see the opinion here. The Supreme Court of the United States, Wendell Holmes, confirmed that enough idiots were enough. He was a eugenicist, the only man on the Supreme Court who opposed this case happened to be another Catholic. Another because I'm Catholic. It would eventually lead to 70,000 forced sterilizations in the United States during your lifetime, by the way, many of them. This sterilization and euthanasia package was what Adolf Hitler used to justify what he did in Nazi Germany. By 1933, he'd taken Madison's The Passing of the Great Race, he'd taken the Virginia Law, he'd taken Henry Ford's newspaper, which you can see here, where he puts down Jewish individuals, and it gave Hitler everything he needed to implement the laws. In fact, the gas chambers were first used in the United States by eugenicists. That's where Hitler got the idea. And Hitler's people loved him because he told them that they were the master race, even though they knew what he was going on in the camps. This is Goering. At his Nuremberg trial, he said any country can control its citizens by telling them there's a problem, by telling them what the answer to the problem is, and telling them that anybody opposes that is a threat to their society. Sound familiar? You've been living it for the last 54 months. You've been living it for longer than that, but it's been a rude awakening for you since then. Well, you've probably heard of Dachau and several of the other, but these are all the prisoner of war camps where human experimentation, forced experimentation, were done on Nazis, on the elite. They arrested the PhDs and the doctors who didn't go along with them, put them in the concentration camps along with the Jews and anybody who disagreed with them. And they did experimentation, including eugenics, genetic experimentation on children and twins and men and women in the camps. This was the 1947 Nuremberg Code that had to be written to find crimes that the doctors had committed that many of you think should be obvious. The problem was it had to be written because physicians in the US, in Canada, in Japan, of China, Russia, France, and every other civilized country were carrying out these exact same experiments on people within their countries, and they now had to make it illegal. So you think that we did a great job probably with Nuremberg. We prosecuted 24 Nazi intelligence officers, elite, judges, doctors. We brought thousands of them illegally into the United States, into Russia, into England, into France, and established them as part of our governments and our operations. We put them in positions of power where they continue to carry this out. This is Dr. Kurt Bloom. He was one of the notorious doctors held on trial, and it was the United States that got him off. Notice what this man did. He was in charge of experimentation upon U.S. troops and Russian troops. He's been involved in vaccine development, anthrax, and aerosolized infectious agents. This man carried these crimes out against American soldiers in World War II, and this country rewarded him by getting him off at the Nuremberg trials and putting him into U.S. government agencies where he continued his work. This is Operation Paperclip, which followed Project 63, which was part of the taking out of these criminals from Nazi Germany and putting them in our country. This is Fort Bliss, Texas, 104 German rocket scientists, and they don't look like they're in prison to me. They look like they're having a good time. The thousands of individuals that were taken to all of the different countries I've already mentioned, including Project 63, Operation Paperclip, Operation Ashavyasham, MK Ultra, a variety that you may or may not have heard about. You can see here examples of the Russian scientists that were the result of taking them out of Nazi Germany and installing them into Russian programs. The military-industrial complex has continued the work with these individuals. I know I am a JFK kid. I was somebody selected in 7th grade to be placed on an advanced doctoral program. My area was physics based upon my aptitude. And the U.S. government was very actively involved with that. It was John Fitzgerald Kennedy who made that program possible. I got my doctorate in physics at age 18. While they continued their process, efforts were made to stop this, and Dwight David Eisenhower, 3 days before he left office, tried to warn the American public in this speech where he warned about the military-industrial complex. Imagine this, a man who had been a general in World War II, fought these individuals. When he became elected as president of the United States, had to keep his mouth shut because he was now responsible for defending these people and preventing you from knowing the jobs that were taking place under their control. What's happened since then? The 1964 Helsinki Ethical Principles Act, and you can see here efforts were made to stop forced experimentation on people requiring informed consent. In 1967, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, of which Article 7 talks about informed consent, was Eleanor Roosevelt's landmark treaty that she decided she did not want to see another Nazi Germany. Kind of hard when you're living in Nazi Germany, because when you bring the Nazis in and you let them control your government and control your research, you have become Nazi Germany. 1975 Biological Convention Weapons Treaty. By 72 we had it, 75 we signed on to it, and we said we would not build biological weapons, we would not store them, if we saw them we would destroy them, we will not keep them, and we signed and ratified, so the president signs, Congress ratifies, on the same day that Russia did. In 1979, the Belmont Report continued with efforts to control experimentation upon people. And in 1989, the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act was enforced, giving more credence to the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. You cannot do this. It is a crime to build a biological weapon. And in 1991, a couple years later, the Ukraine is released from Russia. It's no longer a part of it. In fact, what would happen shortly thereafter is the United States Department of Defense would go in to prior former Soviet Union states and control their biological weapons programs. In fact, this document shows that in 2021, are you with me speed-wise here? In other words, during this pandemic, the United States issued its document to the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty explaining that we went into these countries and we controlled their biological weapon programs. We did not destroy them, we secured them, which is in violation of the treaty. Well, it raises the question, if we're doing such wonderful things, why would you not want verification of a treaty? Because verification is where other countries can prove you have it. You've listened to this in your lifetimes. We want the Iranians to have a verification. We want to verify that other people were doing it. So why wouldn't we have a verification of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty? There's one country that is responsible for that, and you're living in it. The United States of America. And these are the reports that show that the United States did not want verification because even though we knew that Russia had built biological labs in the Ukraine of all places, that we didn't want anybody else to find out what we were doing, our technology. By the way, the treaty says that if you have technology, you will share it. Therefore, there's no threat to any other country. We will all be one big happy family living under treaties. And by the way, the treaties are the supreme law of the land under the United States Constitution. WHO's mentioned in the book. That treaty was signed with reservations and understandings, it's in the book, that says that nothing that WHO or the international health regulations passes becomes the law of the land because it is restrained to a federalist system, which means the states determine what will happen in them. Even if they move forward with this WHO treaty, it's illegal, it breaks the Constitution, it has no validity. Sheriffs, are you with me? In 2012, the United States went further and passed 18 U.S.C. Section 175, which further makes it a criminal action to develop a biological weapon or agent, enhancing the already passed 89 Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. And Section 175A gives teeth to it and demands that the Department of Justice and the U.S. military will take action against anyone responsible for biological weapons being in this country. It's going to be a few minutes, so just, we're going to go through this. Sorry, folks, bear with me. Okay, we followed up on this. We've said that we would stay with it. So in spite of all this, the United States government has funded. That book shows we have funded. The Department of Defense, Health and Human Services have funded with Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick, who tried to recruit me as a physicist just before that book came out to work on biological weapons funded by NIAID. There were 3 games that you probably have heard of. You probably heard of Event 201. SPARS was in 2017, and it is identical to what you just lived through. 7 weeks before the COVID event, the U.S. DOD paid money, over $400,000, for a report to come out at Black & Veatch and the Ukrainian labs to explain COVID. In March, we discovered that the U.S. had 15 labs plus 4 mobile ones, and within a couple of months, the Department of Defense and the Pentagon had recognized that we had 46 of those labs with over $200 million in funding. Again, raising the question of why we would not want to verify this. They have wiped this, as you can see here, when you follow this through, and I know we're going fast, these grants that were once apparent on the internet, and I have screenshots of these, by April of this year, the U.S. Department of Defense has gone on and wiped these from the internet, pretending that that funding stopped in 2013. A criminal act of obstruction of justice. This is what we saw. We saw the viruses. These are coronaviruses. You slice through it, you'll see a crown. When you go back and you look at the PCR data, you will discover that 3 viruses, RS-SHC014, MA15, and RS-3367, match SARS-CoV-2. All 3 of those were funded and paid for by the United States government. The eugenics program, the genetic vaccines, Carrico and Weissman did a very good job of explaining that mRNA with pseudouridine is not only stable, it does not work as a genetic vaccine, it is great for eugenics. These parallel pathways merged together, they were completely separate, but in 2019, we brought them together, responsible for more than 1.2 million deaths, 1.5 million maimed Americans, more deaths and maiming of Americans than the U.S. military has lost since 1776. These two books provide the evidence that these individuals have should be convicted of criminal crimes, of which we've listed in the book. These are the treaties that have been broken and the laws that have been broken. A group of experts I've assembled. You can see Mr. Charles Rixey, who is a former WMD weapons of mass destruction expert, Doctors Deinert, McCarran, and Huff, and myself, along with several others, have more than 10,000 documents to prove that these individuals were responsible for building these biological weapons and the eugenic vaccines. In other words, eugenics. The material in the books lay out criminal case, the vaccine case, and federal legislation that must be enacted to change this. The question is whether, with the world watching, are you willing to cross your Delaware? I am. I've given testimony under oath. Bringing charges, this is a card you have. 3 or 4 more minutes here, Alex. This is a step-by-step process. You can go onto the QR code, if this will go here. It will take you to this page. Step 2 is build my letter. You will click on that. It will give you a letter that looks like this, in which you will then be able to enter your name, your address, so we know who to generate the letter to. You can click hide your address if you want to. Step 4 will then be build your letter. It's a self-explanatory step. When you go through there, once you click for review your letters, you'll see what it has given you. You'll be able to take and then click on the final stage to get your letters, which will then look like this. It will be a cover letter along with information evidence that you can then print off. And it even has the address label for your governor and your attorney general based upon the state that you enter in. Why is it called 10others.org? Because the last step, which you can go to here just before you do the review, is to click on share an email. You'll see this. Once you do that, you click on it, it will turn around and generate a cover letter for you. Have at least 10 other people do that. Have them send it to their governors and attorney generals, repeating it over and over again until we finally get these individuals indicted. It's time we do more than go to these meetings, show up and make ourselves feel good about ourselves. It's time to fix our country and fix our world. It's time to remind these people just who we are, because we are Americans and we need to hold these people accountable. The question is, will you cross the Delaware as your ancestors did to take back your country? It's time to stop the bioweapons and eugenics program. Nuremberg failed. It's time we actually put these criminals behind bars for good.